Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next in our series on leading through uncertainty. And I'm joined today by Nick Peschek, who is my colleague and the head of our EMEA practice. So thank you, Nick, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Welcome from sunny Barcelona.
And Nick and I are both really excited to have also joining us today Margaret Heffernan. Margaret is, an advisor, an entrepreneur, an author, including her most recent book, Embracing Uncertainty. So, as you can tell from the title, her work is very relevant to the conversations that we're having. So, Margaret, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with both of you.
Excellent. Well, looking forward to the conversation. Maybe just to get some of the sort of the boring housekeeping things out of the way. So as some of you who have been with us before know, we're going to use the Q&A. So please do submit questions as we go along. We would love to answer any of the questions you have. So we'll get to that at the end. We'll definitely answer some of the questions. For those that we don't get to, we'll do what we've done before, which is we will send out some follow-up from the webinar, which will also include some additional information. And so look out for that information after the webinar. So maybe just before we get into the conversation with Margaret and hear her wonderful insights on this topic of uncertainty, thought it'd be useful to just set a little bit of context of what we're operating in, right? And why we started this webinar series and why we're sort of having these discussions around how organizations and leaders can lead effectively in today's context. And so maybe just a little bit of data to help ground us on where we sit right now. Some of you have seen this before, but this is the uncertainty index that's put together by the IMF. And the reason we're having this conversation is because uncertainty has been increasing for a little while and is really spiking in today's moment. And that has huge implications for how leaders lead organizations and how we all have to operate in this new environment, right? We have to operate differently. We have to be more agile. We have to be more adaptable. And so the research that we've been focused on is around how you create that adaptability and really focused on these three aspects. So the first one being management approaches. So what do more flexible management approaches look like? And how can we create management practices that are more fit for today's world of greater agility and greater adaptability and less for the world of reliability and consistency? What do sort of adaptive, for those of you who joined us last time, we had Spencer Harrison on who was talking about cultures, and the word he uses is spry, right? Spry cultures that are not rigid and are not the same across the organization, but actually encourage innovation and encourage some differences in the way we think about things, because that's where adaptability comes from. And then finally, the skills and capabilities that we all need in organizations to be better at leading change, to be better at adapting and being agile. And so today's conversation, I think we're going to focus more on the management practices and the change capabilities, but we'll see where we go. So just wanted to set a little bit of context before we jump into the dialogue here. I am going to take slides down. This is a conversation. We're not going to be putting any slides up, so don't slides and can just see our videos as we get into it. So with that context, Margaret, would love to hear a little bit about what led you to embrace uncertainty as the book, right? Like what led you to sort of want to write that book? What led you to want to talk about uncertainty? Just it'll be useful for us to hear a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I guess the first thing is, in 2020, I published a book called Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. And that sort of, the sort of linchpin of that was the research that showed that generally, if you're fantastically rigorous as a forecaster, which means you frame your forecast with start and end dates, and you consult a very broad range of information sources, and you assign a probability to it, and you keep tweaking all of that between the beginning and the end date. And then when you meet the end date, you see how well you've done, what you got right, what you got wrong. So these are standard practices of professional forecasters, if you do all of that with a high degree of rigor, probably about the furthest out you can see with any degree of accuracy is 400 days.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not that rigorous, and lots and lots of people aren't, then it's closer to 150 days. And even so, there will always be huge surprises that just nobody saw coming at all. And this, these sort of what I think of as nerdy data points, just kind of sat in my head for a long time, kind of saying, pay attention to this, Margaret, because we used to teach management as forecast, plan, execute, this sort of three-legged stool of management, and one leg just broke. And that's why everybody's so uncomfortable. So if that chair is broken, how do we sit comfortably? And it was very much about maximizing optionality. It was very much about doing a lot of experimentation, doing innovation before you need to, getting ahead of the game. Action is how you. I was wrong. You could still forecast. Data would, give us. The book came out, I think, 2 weeks before the UK lockdown. And I kind of won the argument hands down, thanks to COVID. But I didn't stop thinking about it. I have a kind of certain things, the ideas are too big to just think, right, I've cracked the whole nut.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I started to think about, well, there were two things. One is I kept thinking about people I had worked with when I worked in television, when I worked running software companies, who seemed to have a kind of uncanny knack of sensing what was coming. And you would not and should not call this forecasting, but they had a better sense of the zeitgeist, for lack of a better word, than other people. And many of these were people I knew, and some of them were people I was fortunate enough to employ. And I thought, how do they do that? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, on some level, and often at some point in their career, these people were all artists. And then I started thinking about the role of art and the sort of one of the many functions it plays in society. And one of them is as holding a mirror up to society, and another one is somehow capturing that before anybody else does. And the poster child for this was, in my head, was a producer in the UK whose show, the original House of Cards, premiered the week that Margaret Thatcher was thrown out of power. And it's like, wow, how do you do that? And of course, some of it's luck, but it took about 3
A bit like timing Uncharted as a book just before COVID. So you got that timing down well.
And astute observers have noticed that all of my books have been probably about 2 or 3 years ahead of their time, which is kind of good for readers and less good for me, right? But anyway, there just seemed to be people who did this. And so I started doing a lot of research into how artists live, work, and experience the world, and the qualities of mind and awareness that this develops. And at the same time, because I advise CEOs of large global businesses, I kept hearing the same complaint, which is we hire really well-educated, credentialed people, but they don't seem to be able to think very creatively or critically. And they want too much instruction. And they need to plan everything meticulously before they can walk out the front door every morning. And this isn't going to work, in this world of the uncertainty index. This is not going to serve us at all. So I started having this, heretical thought that maybe we had a lot to learn from artists, and that while we might not all be artists, we could learn to think like artists, and we could use the very remarkable fact that we're all born creative and see, well, what happened to that and how might we develop the faculties that we certainly were all born with. And that was really, and is the nub of the book that emerged.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. Um,
So, Margaret, I'm curious as a bit of an artist myself. This sounds like one of those Spider-Man quotes. Actually, 20 years ago, I started in the circus, and for me, the farther I get in my career, leading large workshops or big events, I'm pulling almost more on 20 years ago when I was trying to captivate an audience with a look or understand the kind of feeling or energy in a crowd, right? What have you found that helps put business language or language that's familiar enough to people who have grown up in engineering or in finance or in HR or in places where if you say circus, they don't think telling a captivating story, right? They think a silly clown from the 70s. So what have you learned in terms of language to help them start to get comfortable with something new for them?
Yeah. Well, I think it helps, first of all, that having worked in radio and television and film, I then went and ran tech companies. I think that gives me a kind of level of credibility that is definitely helpful. And people frequently ask me, well, wow, that seems a really big change. How did you do that? And I explain that everything I needed to run a TV or a film production team is
Mm,
exactly what I needed to run a tech company. And in fact, not being able to write or read code gave me a great advantage because what I brought to the table in no way threatened the expertise and in some cases brilliance of the people that I hired. They knew I needed them and I knew that I needed them. So that kind of, it stopped this being a dividing issue, which was
mm,
very helpful. But I think there are two other things which I think have been helpful too. The first is that I often talk about kind of creative breakthroughs in business. And I often talk to the people I'm working with about when they had those earlier in their careers. So this is typically CEOs talking about, I remember when I did this fabulous thing. And it reminds them that that creativity was there. And they often become quite nostalgic about it. Because usually this is quite often a seminal moment in their career where they did do something remarkable, which is, what got them spotted as, top talent. So it puts a very happy memory in their mind, which is useful, it's positive, it's open and curious. Um, and I think the other thing is increasingly I talk to companies about strategy being an imaginative process. It has to be because it's about the future which doesn't exist yet. So how could it not be creative? And that pretty much does it. Because if you've got any sense of strategy rather than tactics, that this is about more than just going through and trimming the budget, with nail clippers, then you have to have some future state in mind. And that is, for the time being, imaginary. And your job is to create it. So this is a creative process, or it should be. And then very frequently what happens is people realize that it hasn't been lately. it's either been jump on the bandwagon
Mhm.
or cut costs, or we're having a moment, build like crazy, and we'll clean the mess up later.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea of, strategy has to inherently be creative because, well, you don't know what the future is going to hold, which, as we've talked about, is increasingly true. And I think, you started one of the things you said early on, you said, we've always thought of sort of management practice as this idea of you decide, you make the decisions, you formulate your strategy, you plan it out, and then you execute it. And increasingly, certainly from our perspective, what we're seeing is that just doesn't work because by the time you get to start executing it, the world's changed around you, and so you need this more iterative and a more connected where your formulation and your execution are much more tied together. And I think then you layer on top of that the fact that, to your point, you need to be more creative in figuring out what you're going to try, what you're going to experiment, what you're going to go explore as you're figuring out the plan that you need to implement and as you're executing it. So I think that certainly resonates. I did want to just jump back for a moment to the title of your book, right? Because I love the sort of embrace uncertainty. It's not because the book is entitled how to deal with, or how to be okay with, or how to navigate, or how to live in, right? It's embracing uncertainty. So can you maybe sort of, what to use the distinction between, or not even distinction, but why, I guess, the sense of embracing it, and where do you see that, or where do you see the opportunity in embracing uncertainty?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, partly it's my perversity that when everyone's freaked out by something, I think, well, let's look at the upside, right? I mean, because you kind of have to, because it's not like any of us has the power to change the uncertainty graph. It's also, I did this sort of, I experienced this very strange, not uncharacteristic, but nevertheless quite strange thought experiment when I was standing on a train station and listening to an announcement that said, with total certainty, that the train will arrive in 2 minutes. And for reasons I don't know, I started thinking, wow, imagine if I knew everything that was going to happen in the rest of my life with the same degree of certainty as this train announcement. So I know what I'm going to eat. I know what I'm going to read. I know what movies I'm going to see. I know when my friends are going to die. I know what they're going to die of. I know what I'm going to die of. I know when I'm going to die. And, at first it sounded pretty cool, the notion that I could be confident that every train I took, would be on time or not or whatever. But, as I started going into it in kind of gritty detail, I thought, well, this is terrible, actually. Nobody in their right mind would want this because that turns life into a sort of giant to-do list. And all you do is kind of go crossing things off. And what's the motivation for that? None. So I thought, so that really led me to reframe uncertainty and to realize that the things that are uncertain are very often situations where we have a lot of choice.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice is at times a freedom and at times frightening, but it is where we have impact on our lives. And so instead of running scared of it, which sends us into the arms of people who would love to dictate our lives to us, and the technologies that would love to manage us for maximum efficiency, maybe we would do a lot better to head in the opposite direction and think, okay, where there is uncertainty, there is opportunity. What can I make of it? Isn't that a more productive question to ask?
Yeah.
And then a couple of things happened. Partly I started reading and listening to a lot of Carlo Rovelli, who talks about the degree to which scientists embrace uncertainty, because that's where all the discoveries are going to be made. Nobody runs towards the theory of gravity hoping to discover it, right? There's nothing to be found there. And he also described, and I think this is very brilliant, and I wish it were kind of repeated everywhere, that science is only the best we know so far. That it is that even the theory of gravity is certain as far as we know now.
Yes.
Right? And I thought that's such a liberating concept. It doesn't mean that if I, drop my pen right now, it won't fall to the ground, but it alerts us to contingencies and possibilities and stops us thinking that everything is kind of cast in stone. And then I thought, of course, the scientists that I'd met and interviewed at CERN and in other places, uncertainty was absolutely what they made a beeline for. And then I thought, well, so do entrepreneurs. That's exactly how they think. And then I thought, and so do writers, and so do painters, and so do musicians. A musician isn't hugely motivated to write the same song again. Certain it'll be a hit. And of course, many of the most famous and beloved musicians are ones who frequently change before their fans are quite ready for it. There are many people who've never forgiven Bob Dylan for, electric. But they have this kind of unbounded desire to explore and invent because they want to find out what else is inside them.
Yes.
And the same is true for writers who often shift from poetry to theater to movies to novels to short stories all over the place. This is the opposite of brand new. And so I thought that, in an age where people are feeling pretty trapped and downtrodden, maybe it's, dare I say it, time to look on the bright side. Now, no, it doesn't mean that when you're going into hospital for a cancer test that, this is a ton of fun. It doesn't mean that when your child is ill, this is just a great life-enhancing experience. There are always going to be aspects of uncertainty that are excruciating. But I believe that to the degree that we get good at dealing with uncertainty, that is our only source of resilience when those very darker forms of it present themselves. So it's also deeply about how do we build resilience in ourselves for the scary face of uncertainty that we cannot influence.
Yeah, and at the organizational level, which is where a lot of our research sits, right? You see a lot of the similar themes, right? You see coming out of crises. I mean, we did some research on the 2008 financial crisis and how companies in the sort of outsourcing sector responded. And those who viewed it as not we just got to play defense, but viewed it as an opportunity to try something different, as an opportunity in that crisis to try some new ways of engaging. They actually, funnily enough, they didn't do so well in the first year as far as at least the stock market goes, because that wasn't necessarily seen as valuable in the moment, right? And the deep cuts and the deep cost cutting was seen as valuable. But then if you look at it over a longer period of time, you see those are the ones that actually accelerate. And so this idea that crisis or uncertainty or where we don't know exactly what the path looks like, that's your chance to actually make good decisions around how you seize opportunities. And we see that at the organizational level as well. So definitely, I think some strong parallels there.
And that's also why some of the world's most successful companies started in recessions.
Yes.
Right, which is partly because they're being started by people who aren't afraid. So that courage and imagination is valuable. But they're also getting started at a time when the market's kind of dull, bored, and tired. So they often have opportunities they wouldn't have in a boom season. I remember interviewing the founders of Method home care products who started in the middle of the tech crash. Well, stores were devoid of new products for a while, which is how they got their products in. So that kind of creative resilience is really critical in periods of intense market volatility.
Yes, yes. I would love to maybe turn a little bit to, given sort of that, right? A little bit to what are the leadership capabilities, leadership skills that are more relevant for today's context? I mean, one of the things that we often sort of try to draw the distinction between is clarity and certainty, right? Because important for leaders to be adding clarity in terms of what's known, what isn't known, what sort of the vision is of where we want to head. But not to get stuck in thinking or making the mistake of thinking that clarity is the same as certainty, which is, of course, then leads you to sort of provide this sort of false sense of certainty because you go, this is what's going to happen, and I say it with, total confidence, so I can never sort of, shift when external environments change. So, what else from your work with leaders have you seen as sort of the things that leaders need to either be sort of readjusting their thinking on or capabilities to develop or skill sets that they need to sort of operate in this uncertain environment in a way that allows them to seize these opportunities and not sit in that moment of fear that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah. Well, I think one of them, which may surprise people a little bit, is what I call in the book deep hanging out, which is giving yourself time and opportunity to let your mind wander, to go off piste. And this was drawn to my attention when I talked to the then chief economist at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, who was well known for spending more of his time out of the office often than in the office, and in some very strange places, like talking to faith groups, talking to community groups, talking to ballet dancers and astronomers. And when I went and talked to him about it, I said, it has come to my attention that you do this and that your behavior in this regard is quite strikingly similar to the way that artists kind of pick up the vibe of the day, as it were. Why are you doing this? This is not the typical image of the economist. Let's just put it that way. And he said, well, he was very, very alert to the fact that within his institution, you had a lot of very similar people with very similar mindsets and very similar backgrounds, having very similar conversations, and that did not provide a broad enough spectrum of talents and attitudes for the kinds of discussions and decisions that needed to be had. And in order to do that, he needed to have a broader view of what was going on in the world. It's what I would call a well-stocked mind. And the metaphor there is it's a cupboard full of ingredients that you don't know that you need. But if suddenly 15 people turn up for dinner, you can feed them, right? So it's going around and picking up those things just because they're kind of interesting or they have potential or you've never seen them before, and you trust your mind to make sense of them when the opportunity presents itself. So this is not nearly as structured as R&D. It's much rawer than that. But it's just saying to understand the world, I need to be in the world. To understand the world, I need to see as much of it as I can. And yes, data will pick up some of it, but some of it is too inchoate really to show up. And then what he did is he kind of reversed it and started bringing all of these people into the bank so that those more diverse conversations could happen with everybody. And then he went a little step further, which was to start holding meetings with no agenda in order that people would bring to the meeting what was most urgent in their mind. So they didn't get trapped, by the most senior person's agenda. So I think that capacity to let your mind wander and to take that seriously, to be driven by your own curiosity, is absolutely foundational. It's hard to do. it's hard to protect. I would say that without it, you're in trouble. I would say that a certain amount of courage is required because you're going to have to start projects before you know you need them or what they're going to produce or what you're going to learn from them. You can call them projects. I often call them experiments. It kind of freaks people out because the definition of an experiment is you don't know what you're going to find. But they're what you do when you're not quite sure what to do. It's another way, it's a sort of second stage of stalking the cupboard, right? Let's put some more knowledge in it. Let's put some more directly related strategic knowledge into our cupboard. It takes courage to do that when you know you don't know what the answer is going to be. And, there's some very famous examples of that. The Bjortzorg experiment done in Dutch healthcare by Jos de Blok is a classic example. Actually, a very interesting experiment that I watched at the Bank of England was another example. The characteristic of some companies, W.L. Gore's a case in point, 3M is famous for this, of inventing things which you think have a chance but not any guarantee at all of success. And when they don't work, really thinking hard about what would have to change in the context for them to become relevant. So instead of, like many corporations, burying failed R&D and pretending you had nothing to do with it, not on your watch, really squeezing all the juice out of it, that's really fundamental. And having the resilience to do so and not to label it failure, but to label it learning, I think is important. The agency to do that when there's no obviously compelling need to do it. So it becomes part of the cadence of the business. And I think a great capacity to change.
Yeah.
And I remember once an executive cornering me at a meeting once saying, what do you need to become good at change? And I think I rather flippantly said, you have to do a lot of it. And she later confessed to me that the motive for the question was she'd been offered a job in Canada. This was in the UK. And she didn't know if her kids would adapt well. And so what she was really trying to find out was, should she go? Now, if she'd asked me that question, I would have said, I don't know, I don't want responsibility for this. Anyway, I later ran into her. And because I said, to be good at change, you have to do it, you have to experience it. She had gone to to Canada. They had a fantastic time. The kids had really been very, very resilient and had a very rich experience. And now they're much better at change. So I'm quite maybe perversely attracted to breaking habits, to just make sure you don't get in a rut. And sometimes it can be something as simple as drive to work a different way tomorrow. Because you'll notice things that you won't notice if you take the same old path. But really keep on your toes in terms of being good at change. And don't ever imagine that what you want is a moment in which nothing's changing. Because there is only one moment like that, and that's when you're dead.
And hopefully we don't know when that moment is coming, back to your foresight at the beginning.
Exactly.
So I hear three things, and I can't help but connect it to a current project we're working on. So I hear curious, courage, and change. With a pharmaceutical company right now in Europe, we're helping them with curiosity, courage, and collaboration. Are the three that they've landed on as the leadership behaviors to help them in their evolution as a company. So it feels, and Gaurav and I were talking about this before, unsurprising, right, that we're seeing the same kind of threads and patterns in organizations that are doing this really well. everything that you said, especially well-stocked mind, kind of starts me thinking back to, in a very different way, management by walking around, right? So it's the same, and actually, I think it might be the flip side, because instead of managing by walking around, you're exploring by walking around, or you're experiencing by walking around, to bring that kind of sensing back to some place where you can have a more sophisticated conversation and then some decisions.
Because
One
I
thing.
think that's about a very deep understanding of the context that you're in.
Mm.
And when things are as volatile and uncertain as they are now, it's really important to keep checking that.
Yeah. So one hiccup that we're seeing, and I'm curious if you're seeing this too, is there's both that on one side of the well-stocked mind being curious, and then on the other side, data is more and more available and more synthesized, right? Through AI, through tools that we can kind of quickly ask a pretty complex question that they can give you the three bullet points, whether they're correct or not. How have you seen organizations best balance the staying curious, courageous, and change friendly while being inundated with both more data and actually more insights, right? It's not just noise, it actually is meaningful ways to automate work.
Mm. Well, I think everybody's struggling with that at the moment. The ones that are, I think, have least data analysis experience are struggling with it most because they don't bring a lot of judgment to it. They just want an answer, which I think is incredibly dangerous because they don't know how to judge the answers they're being given or how to develop any sense either of the next question or of whether or not the answer is in any way trustworthy. So I think people who have been working with data a lot, if they've done it well, then they have a much better critical sensibility for that. You know, their first response will always be another question, always another question. And I mean, like you know, your smile when you were talking about, you know, the answer, whether it's right or not. I am absolutely astounded by how wrong many of the answers are in areas where I may not even have great expertise. They're spectacularly wrong, which is a good experience to have on one level, but very frightening if you're dealing with people who don't have a well-stocked mind with which to look at this stuff. So I would say it's very patchy. I think there are a couple of organizations I've worked with who deeply understand it because they've been working with large data sets for a really, really, really long time. And they've made a lot of dumb mistakes, which are great learning. You know, I see a lot of people who just think, "Oh, this is the most fantastic opportunity for cost cutting I've ever been given. Let's do more faster." And they don't quite know why, and they don't really know what. And in many ways, this ought to present an opportunity to absolutely to redefine jobs, not just cut them. And they don't see that opportunity at all. Although it, you know, I think there is a splendid opportunity to start putting together what do we need and what do people want to create actually much better jobs. But I see very few organizations interested in seizing that opportunity. They're so captivated by cost cutting, as are their shareholders, that it hasn't occurred to them that this is a kind of one in a, you know, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to do some fantastic creative thinking from which everybody can derive a lot of benefit.
Yeah. So I just want to go back to the beginning of our conversation, and then Gaurav, actually, you and I have different backgrounds, but we've made it to the same type of place, right? In the work we do. If I started in arts and I'm now kind of bringing that into business, I think you started in business and are bringing the opposite. So, Margaret, I hear you saying at the beginning, bring an artist's mentality into the way that we work.
Mm.
I think with data, we're also saying bring a more data analytical view into maybe an artist's or a design or a kind of less rigorous field, right? Because each of them looks at the other as almost too perfect, right? And actually, if you scratch under the surface, you get to places where you actually realize that it's for exploration. It's not a hard truth. So, Gaurav, you started in operational efficiency in engineering. Kind of what have you seen for folks that have that data science rigor to them as they're exploring AI tools, which seem like a silver bullet?
Well, I think
Well, they're much more critical. Um, they're very good at finding uses for various forms of AI that its inventors never imagined.
right.
Some of them legal, some of them probably not, or shouldn't be. Um, I mean, it's interesting because I'm not quite sure. Two things. I'm not quite sure we aren't more similar than you think, since I did start my career in the arts and then moved to technology, and now I don't know, I'm in some strange liminal space which suits me down to the ground. Um, I'm quite uncomfortable with presenting these as polarities because I think the minds that are going to thrive in this environment are going to bring both of these capacities to what they do. And we don't have many of those people, though we have quite a lot of people, if you like, at either end of the spectrum who are quite curious about one another. And I'm reminded of a scientist at Roche whom I interviewed a few years ago, and I was writing a little book for TED, who brought in a visual designer to work with them on some of their medical device design. Now, this was not a device designer at all.
Mm-hmm.
He brought the artist in simply to ask a whole range of different questions and ended up feeling, I mean, he's a very senior scientist at Roche, that this had been hands down the most rewarding project he'd ever worked on in his life.
Yeah.
So I'm prepared to be quite a lot more radical in the sense that I think we need a very much broader and more diverse range of mindsets at work as we're exploring what this new technology is and what it's capable of. Obviously, we need those in terms of ethics policies and all that sort of stuff. You know, we need sociologists, we need anthropologists and all that jazz. But I also think we need minds that are much bolder in the wondering that they're prepared to do and the questions that they're prepared to ask.
Yeah,
I find most organizations kind of sense this, but they're scared and waiting to see who they might be able to copy.
yeah. Yeah, and I think to me this whole sort of AI conversation, the broader part of it to me is about how do you explore and experiment within organizations effectively? Because I think the reality right now is we don't really know. I mean, even your point, Margaret, around look, it feels like it's an efficiency play primarily, and where's the effectiveness that it drives, and where's the creativity and the innovation? And I think the answer right now is most organizations that at least I've seen haven't quite figured that out. And you're not going to be able to figure it out by sitting in a room, even if you get a diverse group of people sitting in a room and trying to just, figure out what to do. You're going to have to do some experimentation. You're going to have to do some exploration. And
Yeah.
so, when we talk to folks around how do you sort of start to figure out and it's not just, I mean, AI is the latest in this, right? But this has been true of other things in the past. I mean, how to use digital technology and things is still a question around there. So I guess where I was going with it is, and you mentioned this earlier in terms of having the courage to experiment even when you don't know what the outcomes, which pretty much is every experiment, right?
Should be.
Should be, yeah, yeah. Experiments to prove things we already are sure about aren't all that helpful. So I guess where I would love to maybe spend a couple of minutes on is what have you seen work to get and teams and or organizations to adopt this, hey, look, we're going to experiment. That means we're going to try some things that aren't going to work and we're going to learn from them, right? What have you seen work on that front? I mean, you mentioned 3M earlier as an example. By the way, for the audience, the story of the Post-it note from 3M is a great example of the sort of rigor around staying on with something. But what have you seen teams and organizations do well when it comes to creating the sort of environment or the sort of behaviors that prompt that sort of experimentation and learning from experimentation?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say quickly about 3M is one of the mysteries of 3M has always been how do they manage to innovate so fast? And one of the things I discovered when I was writing Uncharted is that they don't. What they do, because they're always doing experiments and they're always doing great debriefs, deep debriefs when the experiment is over. They frequently find that they have products that kind of work, but the market doesn't want them.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of burying those, they kind of put them in the freezer. And when market conditions change, they pull them out, whack them in the microwave, and hey presto, they've got something that everybody else has only just started noticing as a thing. So part of what they're doing is saying, let's just keep exploring all the time. It's typically a percentage of estimated profit for the next financial year. So it is part of a rigorous financial process. So it isn't jeopardized. It's seen as a serious part of the sustainability of the business as a whole. The other example I would think of is W.L. Gore. And the thing I really love about Gore, well, I mean, there are many things I love about Gore, but one of them is that they have a fantastic heuristic for choosing the experiments they will invest in. So they encourage, as you probably know, they encourage everybody to tinker and to come up with ideas and so on. They provide time and some resources for that. But they also understand that an idea is the cheapest part of an innovation process and that you have to have hundreds of them and that they're not these magical things that are worth their weight in gold. Most of them are rubbish, but that's okay because you can get from a bad idea to a poor idea to a kind of okay idea to a great idea. But it would be helpful to cut out a few of those if you could. So they have this fantastic heuristic, which is, let's say Nick has a great idea. He's a very creative soul, and he goes and he pitches it. And the first question he's going to have to answer is it real? In other words, does it present the opportunity for a verifiable improvement in something we already know something about? Even if it's not in our business, we can do some research and see, does it suggest something significant? The second question is it worth it? Which is a question about your idea, does it address a market where there is significant revenue to be captured? And the third question is, can we win? Is that market so dominated by a single player that we haven't a chance in hell of getting in? So classic example, a guy at 3M, 3M's fortune is based on PTFE, this long molecule that repels water and dirt. He tries painting the spokes on his racing bike with PTFE. Will it go faster? Answer is yes. Is it real? Well, yes, it does make him cycle faster. Is it worth it? Number of people who want to shave 1,000th of a second off their time, not big enough. Kill the idea fast. Goes that other hobby, playing guitar. He's playing he's changing the strings on his guitar. Why? Because guitar strings go limp because they absorb the oil in your hands. So he thinks, if I painted the guitar strings with PTFE, will they last longer? Yes, they do. Is it real? Yes, it is. They last 10 times longer. Is it worth it? Market for guitar. Every country in the world has something like a guitar. It's a huge market. Can we win? It's totally disaggregated. It's full of all sorts of, mom and dad companies. Nobody's got it. You don't know anybody in the guitar string market, but nobody owns it. Gore dominates the guitar string market now globally. Right? So the glory of the heuristic is it gets rid of bad ideas really fast so that people don't get too enamored of them and then too heartbroken, and you don't waste a ton of time on them. And the great thing is that if you can pass all those tests, it's worth investing in for you and for the business.
I really like that point, right? Because we often think of experimentation in terms of deciding what to experiment on. And I think what you're talking about is if you don't have a process for how quickly you move on from experiments, one way or the other, then yeah, it does create the challenge that I think leaders are often afraid of, which is a whole bunch of activity that doesn't necessarily result in anything productive. And so having those processes in place for how you deal with what comes out of the experiments ahead of time makes it much more likely to be able to encourage experimentation.
But the other thing that's
So
great,
I really like that. So
but I think the other thing that's great is it means people can kill off their own ideas.
yes,
So you don't have to, because managers hate, raining on your parade.
yes.
So you can kill it yourself and move on or not move on. But so it stops people getting stuck and investing too much before anybody's kind of thought about it coherently. And as somebody who has about 5 ideas a day for a new business or a new book or a new play or something, I find it really useful to think, should I go down this path? If the answer is no, I'd much rather know quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and if you don't have the ability to kill your own ideas, the other challenge is if somebody else is going to kill it eventually, then that's probably, you're only going to do that a couple of times before you go, you know what? I'm just gonna stop. So no, I think in terms of when we talk about dispersed decision making, when we talk about empowering sort of employees to be able to not just come up with ideas, but actually act on them, having the ability to make your own calls, both up and down, I think is a critical component of that. Maybe just before I'm sort of looking at the time a little bit, I did want to get to one other sort of topic area, which is sort of this balance between, if I look at the last 30 years, I think one of the mantras in organizations has been efficiency, 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 right? And we've done a lot to drive really good improvements. I mean, Nick, you mentioned
Mm.
my past, I did a lot of work on operational efficiencies, which was really about how do you get the performance of the organization from an efficient standpoint, right? And I think COVID was a bit of a moment where people went, hang on, there is actually a downside, even in a supply chain context, to efficiency because you're sacrificing to
Yeah.
some level flexibility in your supply chain. And so this sort of tussle or tension between how far do I push efficiency and how much does that mean I'm sacrificing on innovation and flexibility? I think is a hard
Hmm.
question for leaders because there's no obvious answer. But I wonder if you have any insights into how to go about making that sort of how to approach that decision process of that balance
Hmm.
between efficiency and flexibility.
Yeah. I guess the way I think about it is I like to look at processes within an organization and think about which of these are complicated and which are complex. So complicated processes are ones where I can pretty much see the whole process from beginning to end. I control it. I know the people. It and it has massive amount of predictable repetition within it. So the analogy I always use is when I go to the airport, when I check in, that's complicated. The food getting on the plane is complicated. The luggage handling is complicated. It doesn't really matter what mood I'm in, whether my bag gets loaded or whether the food is disgusting as I, usually expect it to be. They're quite complex because these apparently simple processes may involve a very large number of contractors and subcontractors and so on. But actually, everybody's luggage is pretty much the same. Everybody's going to eat the same old horrible food. They're going to watch the same old stale movies. So these kinds of processes are fantastically well optimized for efficiency. Once you get, a complex environment is one where actually you can't see the whole process end to end. You definitely don't have power over it. And you may not even have influence over it. So with supply chain, the advantage, of course, is, currency arbitrage, labor arbitrage, specialized skill, all that kind of stuff. But it's laid us open to currency volatility, good and bad, political volatility, labor relations volatility, which I have virtually no chance of controlling. It may, complex processes may also be changing so fast, AI being a classic example, that expertise isn't necessarily, or experience isn't going to give me the reassurance that I would like to have. And in those environments, efficiency is going to strip me of all the spare capacity I might need to be able to respond quickly to something I couldn't predict.
Yeah.
The complex environments, there are repetitions, but they're not predictable. So we think there's a cadence, but actually there isn't. We just have a sort of illusion of it. And of course, again, in Uncharted, I wrote about, on the third page, epidemics, because epidemics have the classic characteristic of a complex system, which is, the epidemiologist's joke is if you've seen one epidemic, you've seen one epidemic, right? They're definitely coming, but you don't know where they're going to start, when they're going to start, or what the pathogen's going to be. In that situation, you can't afford to have only one response.
Yeah.
And this is why, in 2017, the Wellcome Trust started developing vaccine platforms for 6 diseases that had epidemic potential. So they started way before they needed to, and they chose the pathogens according to how likely they were to have a very serious impact. Because you can't choose all the diseases in the world,
Yeah.
And we're just all very lucky that one of those was coronavirus. And we started working on that in 2017, not as fairy tales have it in 2020.
Yeah.
So that's institutionalized resilience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that heuristic of likelihood and severe impact is a really good way to start focusing where you need to be. You need more resources than is efficient, because it's simply too dangerous not to have them.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So yeah, I think the takeaway for me from that is you can optimize complicated processes, and you should look to optimize complicated processes.
Absolutely.
But the ones that are unknowable, the things that are uncertain, the things where the information is not available, that are complex, those are the areas where you need to build in some flexibility. So,
and the thing I think is really germane is for executives to understand in any of their processes which fits into which category.
Yes.
Because if you deal with what's complicated by giving it lots of extra resources, you're wasting money.
Yeah.
And if you deal with complexity through efficiency, you're putting yourself in danger.
So one of the things we love to do at the end of these webinars, as we're getting to the end here, is a little bit of what are some of the takeaways that the audience might be thinking about from the conversation. And so this is one of those, right, Margaret? I think this idea of for leaders, look, be really clear around which parts of your processes are complicated, which parts are complex, and then look to optimize the complicated ones and make sure you have enough flexibility in the complex ones, right? So I think that's one. I'm just going to track a couple of other things that I've been tracking through the conversation, and Nick and Margaret, if please add thoughts that you think are important. But I'd say the other one is, this idea, Margaret, you brought up of look for things that are habitual, because if you break your habits, you're likely to find some opportunity. Not always, but often, right? And so look for things that have become habitual. They've just become the way we do things. It's become that's just how we do it here. Right, look for those, and then there might be opportunity hidden behind those. This point around the courage to experiment, but also having a process that allows you to evaluate those experiments. The example you sort of used from Gore around the heuristics, just having some sort of a process in place, I think is something again teams can do very easily. Is put in some of that process so that you can actually start to experiment faster and move through things faster. And then the last one I'd call out is, this idea of seeking out a broader viewpoint, letting your mind wander, having a well-stocked mind. One tactical example of that you brought up that I think is good is having a few meetings where there is no agenda, right? They're the meetings where actually they are meant for exploration. They are meant for a broad discovery kind of conversation, and we're not sticking to an agenda. So, just a few things for the audience to be thinking about. As we always do in the follow-ups, we will share some of this. We did sort of run out of time on Q&A, so if you have questions, please do submit them, and we will respond to as many of those as we can. Last thing for me is to just say thank you so much, Margaret, for joining us. It's been a really insightful conversation, and hopefully you had some fun as well.
Definitely, I did. Thank you for the wonderful and very good provocations in your questions. Because this is where we are now, right? We've all got to figure it out, like it or not.
Yes, indeed. Fantastic. Well, if there's no last words from you, Margaret or Nick, I would just say thank you to everybody for joining us, and have wonderful days.
Right. Thanks so much.
Okay, everyone.
Bye-bye.